Ask Reddit. What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named that Project Sunshine? The German radar guidance system Wotan was a great example on why your project or operation name should have nothing to do with their content. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions are the norm. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kind of sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. This was so prevalent that between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 following this time. Black and poor women too. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 60s going to the doctor for an appendectomy and leaving sterilized without being told. Many didn't find out for years until they realized they should have gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962. And given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favorite teachers to this day. He and I were able to go into a lot of other things the US has done. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious something hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate. They died astronauts. That's something to be admired. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy. But there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted many tests, for example blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with a co-pilot, or ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. NZ is not real. MK Ultra, partially illegal. Forced mind control experiments utilizing psychoactive drugs conducted by the CIA in 1950s or 60s. More specifically, the death of Frank Olson. Olson was going to expose Project MK Ultra. Olson was a CIA employee who was dosed with LSD by his supervisor and then committed suicide 9 days later by jumping out of his hotel window. After an autopsy, there was some evidence found that he was unconscious when he plunged out of the window. The Nixon administration had a speech prepared for if the moon landing had failed, and it's chilling. Really is chilling. Imagine if they landed on the moon and were unable to lift off again, just having to sit there and stare at Earth as they die. Yikes. Imagine looking up at the moon today and knowing there are two bodies up there, staring at two corpses every night. I like to think they'd have sent someone to bring the bodies back, and the movies about that mission would be doing huge box office numbers, I bet. We got to go retrieve Matt Damon. Again. Canadian here. The Somalia affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be fucking evil. We have something similar in Belgium. Belgian soldiers tortured kids in Somalia in 1993. Not declassified but leaked. Operation Yellowhammer. The government tried to say it was old, but it had an August date on it. It's the UK government's plan for the eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. Basically, life in the UK would be turned upside down for a few months. Food and medical shortages are expected. The royal family might be evacuated to a safe place. Police will have too much on their hands to investigate crime, etc. Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. However, Germans didn't come that close to making a nuclear bomb. They didn't consider it a priority because they calculated that it wouldn't be a decisive weapon to win the war, especially against US who would already have nuclear bombs in their arsenal. Estimates put the probable year for a German nuke if the efforts continued around 1947. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Maralinga. Oh yeah, some aboriginals lived nearby. The government were going to nuke Scotland for a while, I think. Then they realized that was a stupid idea as Scotland is a pretty small place relatively speaking, and nuked Australia instead. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do as the Americans and nuke a territory in the Pacific. The Pitcairn Islands are still British and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. Australia was independent in the 50s. I can't imagine the High Commissioner asking if we could nuke part of Australia. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings. Basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. You should watch The Holy Mountain. In it they talk about knowing they will have to go to war with a country in 15 years. They make comic books and toys with a villain that looks like the other race. They also make a type of medicine the same color as the skin of that race. All sorts of things to prepare kids to hate a particular race by the time they are of military age and the war is fought. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession. A couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them, a lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Dahmer should have been prosecuted for what he did in the army. For Cap Shaw, it began the day he and Dahmer, an army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once, and eventually, he leapt from the third-floor window to escape. I had probably been raped 8 to 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pool rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me, or he would beat me after. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city. Can't remember which. but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia, they still haven't found it. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. LOL, we had a plane arrive in Barksdale carrying a live nuke and nobody knew how it got on the plane. Oh, Air Force. Oh, I remember when that happened, not long after I joined. It wasn't just one nuke, but 6 of them. The Air Force literally was missing 6 nukes and had no idea. Not long after that, they accidentally shipped ICBM parts to Taiwan. Oh, you made it to the end! Smash like and subscribe for more amazing content!